and welcome to the end of the world, or at least the end of the church year. This weekend wraps up the Year of Grace 2024. Our album for this year was titled Freedom and Peace. Next year, I look forward to introducing a brand new album as we start the 2025 podcast year. Thank you so much for tuning in, and God bless you. In the Old Testament Jewish society, there are three key figures that you'll see. The first is the priest. The priest ministers in the temple, offers right worship to God, offers the sacrifices that cleanse the people. The priests are responsible for this sort of ritual purity before God. The second figure you see is the prophet. The prophet is called by God to speak the truth. And sometimes that can be uncomfortable truths, that the people are drifting away from right worship, that the true worship of God has become corrupted, and the people need to repent and return to God. The third figure that we see is the figure of the king. And King David is sort of the example par excellence. But the king has sort of two functions. The first is to protect the people. Picture the walled cities of the ancient world, the walled city of Jerusalem. The king's job is to keep this walls from being breached, to keep the enemy from getting into the city. He organizes the fight against outside forces that could be attacking the city. But the other thing the king is responsible for is for rightly ordering life within the city, for making sure that justice is done, especially for the poor, but also making sure that people are being held accountable for their proper roles and jobs. While we picture working at a company, but a company where the leader isn't particularly good at leading, right? When you're in a company like that, you have these different people sort of stepping on each other's toes, who's really responsible for that, and there's nobody that's there to sort it out for you. But also you might have employees in that company that aren't really doing their jobs, that aren't actually doing what they were supposed to do, and you need the leader to hold them accountable. Well, when the leader won't do that, when the leader is afraid of what people will think of me, or is too concerned about other things than running the company well, then you end up with people not being held accountable, right? So we can see the importance of this sort of kingly role of protecting the people, but also rightly ordering the community. So when the Jewish people are anticipating a new Messiah, they were anticipating basically a new priest, a new prophet, and a new king, right? The priesthood was there. The priesthood was hereditary, but it needed to be held to account. And so they're anticipating a new prophet like Elijah and a new king. And what we find in Jesus is that Jesus is not only the true priest and the true prophet, but he is also the true king. That in Jesus, God sends all of these roles are in one person. And we see that foreshadowed at his nativity, where he's given what gifts? What are the gifts that baby Jesus receives? Gold, frankincense, and myrrh, right? So the gold is rightly testifies to his kingship, right? The frankincense testifies to his priesthood, and the myrrh testifies to the prophets, who were all mostly killed for their prophesying, right? So it's his embalming, it's his sacrifice. So it speaks to priesthood, his prophecy, and his kingship. Now, when we think of Jesus nowadays, we often think of him in terms of his prophetic role. We think of him as a teacher. We think of him as one who's not afraid to speak the truth, even in the midst of powerful forces that come against him. We think of him as a good spiritual guide, right? So we think of that prophetic role. We often think of his priestly role, of Jesus offering the one perfect sacrifice, being the Lamb of God and offering himself to the Father to reconcile us to the Father, to forgive our sins. But also the healing work that he does his healing of sicknesses and his casting out demons. Those are priestly functions. But we don't often think of Jesus in terms of his kingly role, and I think that's partly because Jesus is, there's powers all around us. We have to obey our civil authorities, right? So we see these earthly powers, and compared to them, Jesus seems to be not very powerful. It seems as though we'd get along better if we accommodated whatever happens to be the king of our current day. But Jesus is also the king. He's responsible for protecting his people and for rightly ordering his people, for holding us accountable. But there are differences between Jesus' kingdom and the kingdom of this world. So they've chosen for today's reading this moment when Jesus is on trial before Pontius Pilate. And the neat thing about the way St. John writes this scene is that he's setting it up in such a way that the actual person on trial is Pontius Pilate. That Pontius Pilate thinks he has all this authority. He thinks he's the final authority in this particular scene. But in reality, Jesus is the true king, and Jesus is judging Pilate, not by coming down on him, but rather by inviting Pilate to live in the truth. He's trying to hold him accountable. We see a key difference, though, which is that the kingdoms of this world will use threats and force and violence to accomplish their tasks, to force people to obey them. But the kingdom of Jesus Christ is voluntary. Jesus doesn't force anyone to accept his kingship. There's a catch, though, and we'll talk about that later. The second thing we see is that Jesus' kingship is a kingdom of truth. And this is contrasted to the kings of this world who like to control the narrative, who want to be able to say it, and they would like to have authority over the truth, but they don't. And so instead they choose half-truths or even outright lies to tell it the way they want it to be or the way they want us to believe it. Whereas they want to believe that the truth serves them, but that's not true. And Jesus accepts the truth. He is the true king, and he is a king who lives in the truth. We also see that the powers of this world want to be the highest authority. They want everyone to bow down to me, and I don't want to bow down to anyone. But Jesus, we see, submits to his Father, and it's his willingness to obey his Father that then makes Jesus worthy of obedience. So that willingness to submit himself to a higher authority. We also see that a key hallmark of Jesus' kingdom is his love for his people. That, sometimes kings can really love their people, but in many cases, kings love themselves, and they want what's best for them. Whereas Jesus is a king who loves his people. Lastly, we see that the kingdoms of this world expect us to serve them. And yes, we serve Jesus, but here's the thing. He serves us first. Like Jesus lays down his life for us, he serves us. And then he invites us to serve him and to serve one another in return. So Jesus is a king who is also a servant. We don't get to vote on the king. And that's good, because we have a track record for making some pretty terrible choices when it comes to picking our own leaders. Jesus is the king, and he was chosen by his Father. He didn't seize the kingship from someone else, and he won't pass it on to someone else when he's done. The kingdoms of this world come and go. Oceans rise, kingdoms fall. It's much harder when it's all your call. But Jesus doesn't come and go. Jesus receives the kingship as a gift from his Father. And so his kingdom is here right now. Like I said, his kingdom is voluntary. You don't have to accept it. I can break Jesus' laws all I want, and his angel police are not going to show up and throw me in prison, right? But the catch is that Jesus is the true king, and his kingdom is going to be revealed at the end of time. And when I choose to accept him, to accept his lordship, to serve him, to follow his example, I'm voting myself into his kingdom. When I try to be the king myself, when I try to be the ruler, when I reject the truth, when I make others serve me, I'm voting myself out of his kingdom. So I get to choose which kingdom I join, the kingdom of Jesus or the kingdom of this world, which ultimately is in fact the kingdom of Satan. And this is the choice that we get every day. So while we don't vote in the king, we vote ourselves into his kingdom or out of it. And now we see the importance of our everyday decisions. Do I try to be the boss? Do I try to get others to serve me? Do I want to be in control? Or do I allow Jesus to be the Lord of my life? Do I try to serve him? Do I allow him to set the agenda for my day and for how I behave? And that, I think, is really key, is that the kingdom of Jesus is something that when we submit to Jesus, it makes us better at being a citizen. It makes us better at serving here and now. It makes us better husbands, fathers, brothers, sons, children, because Jesus' power is something completely separate from this world, but his kingdom is all around us and it's available to us. And he wants to rightly order the earthly world, and he also wants us to protect us from danger. And so when we accept his kingship, we're entering into this rightly ordered world and we're being kept safe from all danger. I want to give you one final example, because it can happen that serving the kingdoms of this world and serving God come in conflict. And when they do, we should always choose to serve the true king. And when serving the true king, we might follow him to the cross. There was an Austrian guy named Franz Jagerstatter. His parents weren't married, actually, when he was born, and his father ended up dying in World War I. And his mother eventually married a farmer, and the farmer adopted Franz as his son. Franz was a bit of a wild child, apparently. He had a reputation as a womanizer. He liked adventure. He was the first one in his little town to buy a motorcycle. And eventually he got a young milkmaid pregnant, and she gave birth to a little daughter. And even though his friends doubted that he was actually the dad, he took care of her and paid child support. He ended up going to the mines for about 3 or 4 years, and he'd been drifting away from his Catholic faith for a long time. But he came back from serving in the mines, and he had this kind of a new sense about what was really important in life. And he ended up marrying a very pious young lady, Francisca, and the two of them actually did their honeymoon as a pilgrimage to Rome. He comes back from this and he starts going to daily mass. He becomes the local cemetery sexton, and he will often turn down the fees that were paid for the grave digging. He preferred to see it as a corporal work of mercy, that he was burying the dead as a service, as an act of love, rather than as a side job. Well, Nazis come to power in Germany, and then Germany wants to annex Austria, which is very popular among many, but he didn't see the Nazis as a positive step forward. And so he was the only one in his village that voted against unification with Germany. And he couldn't see why so many Catholics were willing to accommodate the Nazis just because they appeared to be very powerful. He could see that they were persecuting the church and that they had very anti-Catholic views. They start rounding up and killing folks with disabilities in order to improve the human race. And he was drafted into the military a couple times, but the mayor ended up getting him released because he was a farmer. He'd taken over his dad's farm, and it was useful to the Germans to have this farmer. So he was able to come back, and he eventually began to decide that he was not going to take the Hitler oath, and serving in the military he felt was cooperating with evil, that the Nazi invasions of other countries, people were saying, oh yeah, but they're going to end communism. And he said, well, if that was their only goal, then why would they be invading these other countries and trying to seize territory and mines and oil wells. So he came to the conclusion that he would refuse to serve, and his parish priest tried to talk him out of that. He met with the bishop and was really disappointed. The bishop seemed to be very wishy-washy and using sort of legalism. So he gets drafted, and he tells the draft board that he will not fight, that he would do non-combat roles in the military, but he would not shoot other people. And he's promptly arrested and spent 3 months in prison. His wife wrote him and tried to convince him to change his mind, but they wrote back and forth, and eventually she began to see that he had this deep sense of conviction that this was the right thing to do, and he was willing to do it no matter what it would cost him. The night before, he was convicted of undermining military morale, and the night before his execution, a chaplain came to visit him with a copy of the New Testament. And he said, I have such a sense of communion with Jesus that if I were to read the scriptures, it would distract me from that communion. He said, Jesus is giving me so much strength and so much peace. People remarked at this simple sense of clarity. So he was executed, and it took a long time for his village to accept him. In fact, his name was intentionally left off the war memorial of the folks from his village who had died in the war because he'd obviously refused to serve. But eventually, the people became proud of him as they began to see the consequences of their own complicity with the Nazis. His cremated remains were returned to his parish and ultimately were interred in the church altar, and he's considered a second patron and a martyr for the truth, a martyr for goodness. He was considered blessed now. His wife lived to be 100 years old before she passed away, so clearly the Lord took care of her, even though her husband was no longer there to take care of her. And we see here a man who has this clear sense of what it means to serve the true King, and is willing to serve the true King regardless of who's in power temporarily here on earth. We need to remember that Jesus is a priest, Jesus is a prophet, but Jesus is also a king. And each of us are called to let Jesus be the Lord of our life. So Sven and Oli are out hunting and they get lost. And Sven says, well, maybe we should try firing 3 shots up into the air and maybe we'll get the attention of somebody. So Oli says, okay. So he shoots off 3 shots. They wait a while. They don't hear anything. So Sven says, well, maybe we should try it again. And Oli says, okay. So he shoots 3 shots up into the air. They wait a while. No, but nothing happens. Sven says, well, maybe we should try it one more time. And Oli says, well, it better work this time because I'm down to my last 3 arrows.